Okay, welcome to NABA Perspectives. It's a new podcast series from the Norwegian-African Business Association, where we look at some of the big issues that are driving economy, policy, investment, and business in Africa. I'm Lamre Akinola, the head of content at NABA, and on this first episode, we are going to be looking at the topic of critical minerals. I'm delighted to be joined by Isabela Nyoka. She's a mining finance specialist at Ecobank Zimbabwe to break down this topic a little bit more. Isabela, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for joining this first episode of NABA Perspectives.
Thank you, Landry. Thank you to NABA for having me on this platform.
Of course, this is a continuation of a discussion that we've been having at NABA, including with you. Most recently, just a few weeks ago at the Nordic-African Business Summit in Oslo on the 5th of September. For the purpose of this conversation, let's start with the big picture. Let's zoom out here and kind of just maybe do a 101 on the critical minerals issue. Now, I remember a time not too long ago, actually, where unless you were in mining, the mining sector wasn't particularly interesting to anyone outside of the industry. But that is changing and changing very rapidly because of the emergence of the critical minerals issue. And that is attracting a tremendous amount of attention internationally. It's becoming a real priority for African mineral producers. To kick us off, what's going on here? What is this all about? Why are we talking so much about critical minerals? What are they? Why are they so important? And why is Africa so important to this debate?
Yeah, thanks, Landry, for that. I would say mining previously was not maybe that exciting because people were not that much alerted to the importance or the role that minerals play in our daily lives. I mean, we take minerals for supplements, we use minerals in manufacturing and so forth, but it wasn't that much of a big deal because industrialization happened and everybody, just relaxed and they didn't give much thought as to where what comes from and what gets into what to get things produced or made. So here we are now within the bigger context of the climate change agenda or the Paris Agreement on climate change and what countries need to do to mobilize themselves into proper structures geared towards climate adaptation policies for the globe to build a broader climate resilient economy. So hence the center stage now, that role that is being played by critical minerals, because they are now coming in as components in either production of materials that are required for green energy generation or for transmission or for energy storage. Now everyone is alerted to the idea that, we need green energy sources. So where are we going to get the critical minerals that are required for storage of the energy, let's say? Because we're transitioning into electric motor vehicles, you will need a battery powered car, but you need long range, so you need longer storage capacity in the batteries. And our batteries in their current form do not do that. And hence people began to focus on newer technologies such as your lithium ion batteries, or there's longer duration of storage capacity in these batteries that are made of lithium, and hence the interest. So this is why I think the whole globe is worked up around, we need more of these minerals. They are critical to the transition from fossil fuel-based energy sources to green energy sources. And then a realization, I don't know whether it's a realization, but all of a sudden, the geopolitical issues impacting on production of these minerals then are brought to the fore. Nobody used to mind the fact that most of the mineral processing, from smelting to refining capacity, and even to fabrication or industrial use to some degree, had become concentrated on China. So everybody now is looking to source these critical materials from China, and people are like, but this can't work. We are in North America. We need to ship a long way from there. We are in Europe. We're going to rely on just one supplier. So what do we do? So I think this is why we have such a vibrant discourse around, and it will continue to unfold as we develop these conversations.
No doubt, and I want to pick up on the issue of geopolitics that you've just touched on. But first, Africa finds itself very much at the center of this debate. We know, anybody who's familiar with Africa knows that the continent has abundant mineral reserves. It has been an exporter of mineral resources for a long time. But now when it comes to the critical minerals issue, the continent is gaining renewed significance in terms of the green transition. Could you give us a bit of a sense of why Africa is so central to this conversation around critical minerals?
So Africa, for one, we speak of the production capacity that you alluded to. I'm just going to look at a map here. You won't be able to see it, but it's covering some of the big countries inside of sub-Saharan Africa that have got either part of the battery minerals that are required, part of the minerals required for battery production, or all of them. You look at the DRC, they have copper, cobalt, the triple Ts, tungsten, tin, tantalum. You look at Zimbabwe, it's got lithium, it's got nickel. You look at Mozambique, it's got graphite. You look at Sierra Leone, it's got bauxite here. Then there's lithium discoveries coming through, manganese. You look at Guinea again, manganese, lithium coming through. So all these are critical minerals. Then we're looking at Angola, Namibia, Mozambique. So all of them, it's like they're concentrated in the sub-Saharan African regions. And then the issue of, I think you might recall that since the early 2000s, the African governments adopted a deliberate policy towards beneficiation and increasing their participation in the value chain. So everybody is concerned. The minerals are there. We want to get them out of Africa, but there's either an export ban. So I'm looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 African countries here. That's DRC, Angola, Madagascar, where there is a ban on export of such raw commodities. Then we have an export tax, Zimbabwe for one, Zimbabwe, Zambia, South Africa. If you're going to export unbeneficiated lithium, you're going to have to pay an export tax on that. So all those dynamics now, because there's regulatory pressure or policies that then inhibit just the free flowing of those minerals. Not that it's a bad thing, because we need these regulations for the development of the continent as well. So, and hence, this is why I think it's taking center stage, because now people are looking at ways of cooperating with these African producing countries to make sure that it's a win-win opportunity for everybody. That's my view.
Now, you've touched on what really is the heart of the matter, certainly from the African perspective, from the perspective of mineral producing countries, which is, you use the key word beneficiation, which alludes to the value chain and the big question of who benefits, right, from this surge in critical minerals. Before we get to that, which is really the meat of the discussion, I would say, I want to go back to the point you made around geopolitics. This is becoming, or has already become, quite a geopolitical issue. You touched on the reality that China controls much of the value chain. It dominates the value chain, in fact, in terms of EV batteries, electric vehicle production. And that is now spurring, let's say, competition from other parts of the world. The US very prominently, Europe obviously, but there really isn't a part of the world now that isn't looking to secure access to critical minerals, secure access to the value chain. And that is generating, again, a tremendous amount of interest in collaboration and partnership with African countries. If you just scan the news, like, just today in preparation for this call, I did a quick Google News search on critical minerals Africa, and there are just so many stories about Japan partnering with African countries, the US partnering, the EU partnering with African countries. So there's obvious competition is obviously heating up. How do you see this dynamic? What are some of the important things to understand when it comes to the geopolitics of critical minerals?
I would take a step back a little and say geopolitical issues, yes, are an imperative driver now because we're talking the energy transition and so forth. But I would honestly, as an African and as a citizen of the world, I'd always desired for countries and continents to look at geopolitical issues in the context of our global ecosystem of humanity. We need each other to survive. We need each other to grow. We are talking that Africa now has got this whole deposit, humongous deposits of mineral wealth, but we need the capital to be able to develop them into products, and that capital is sitting elsewhere. So it's unfortunate that in the past, our relationship either with the West, America or Europe, was in the context of political liaisons, like your former colonizers or your former subjects, or there is some political impasse and then sanctions are just pasted onto a country, a whole host of them, without even thinking or considering the impact on the broader citizenry of the continent. So I think these are some of the things that have got to change. China, on the other hand, I think was so resource focused, coming from the pressures of the fact that they've got such a big population, they've got people to feed, they've got to modernize, they've got to find efficient ways of managing that population. And so much of it was going to be resource dependent. And so you'll find that about 44 or 45% odd of the mineral processing potential of the world is sitting in China right now. That's where most of the smelters are. That's where most of the refineries are. And 45% again of the first industrial use of such minerals again is in China, because that's where most of the further processing is happening. I mean, they positioned themselves early on in the 90s or 80s, if you like, as a destination for cheap labor, and then now they are transitioning from the cheap labor to technology, doing things in a faster and nimble way. So there has been a deliberate policy on the part of China, and I commend China for that. What we had not seen from Europe or from America is that readiness and eagerness to work, not necessarily just based on the basis of wants, but just to cooperate with Africa on the basis that we part of a global ecosystem for the development of a resilient global economy in the long term.
I really like the point that you make around the need for collaboration when it comes to critical minerals. And I would say that one of the maybe concerns around the geopolitical framing of the critical mineral space is that, or let me rephrase that. I mean, do you see that it seems from your comments that there's some concern there that it might have a not necessarily the most positive effect in terms of the development of these resources in Africa? Is that a valid concern that, looking at it through this lens of geopolitical competition is kind of missing the point and potentially undermines, the ability to not just for African producers, but as you said, for the world to come together here to make this work?
So I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I think the focus is on just let's compete on how to get access or hands on these critical minerals and how do we get to control the value chains, or how do we get to divert the value chains out of China and send them on Europe or America or somewhere else in Africa where everybody else can get to participate in. That's okay, but that's not so okay, because I think it's quite short term. It's not framed within the context of the fundamental developmental requirements that are required for everybody to grow together. It shouldn't really just be inspired by the fact that, okay, there's too much, fine, from a risk perspective, there's too much concentration risk on one continent, which is China. That I agree. We need to diversify or divest and make sure that all those critical minerals are accessible from different points on the globe in a cost-effective manner, so that everybody can participate and so capacitate all the economies to transit to green energy. But that said, Africa itself still has some existential developmental requirements that are still not being taken into account. So I like to see Africa taking up the agency in driving this discussion around how do we collaborate with you, as opposed to people saying, oh, so how do we get Africa to do this? Because, I mean, you look at Africa, a continent of about 1.28 billion people. According to the International Energy Agency, they say about 600 million in Africa are deprived of access to energy. So imagine that, and what that means in terms of inhibiting the developmental potential. It inhibits Africa's capacity to mobilize that human capital and get it to be productive, because people can't access the internet, people don't have the access to energy to further their skills or education or whatever it may be. So that is critical. So I like, yes, the idea of competition, because what China has done or demonstrated to the world is to awaken the West from its huge stupor, if I may use that word, of thinking that they are the end all of the world and they don't need anything else from anybody else. And hence now the realization that, oh, we must have been, sitting on our laurels, allowing China to develop, but they have worked for it. What I would want to see, though, is Africa taking the agency and the leadership in driving this discussion in a manner that will not leave us as a continent just shipping.
You're muted, Isabela.
Letting meaningful partnerships, important global players to unlock this.
I think this is the perfect segue into the conversation around who benefits. And the important point here is, how do African mineral producers and African economies in general benefit from the obvious huge boost in investment that is happening and that is to come. Yeah, this is only, in many ways, we're at the start of this process. And the amount of money going into the development of critical minerals is only going to increase. The key question there is the value chain. We've already touched on beneficiation. Before we look at some concrete examples, and it would be great to get your perspectives on a country like Zimbabwe, for example, and how Zimbabwe is tackling this. In very simple terms, for people who are not experts in the field of mining and critical minerals, what are the key building blocks of this value chain? And what does that tell us about the opportunities for beneficiation?
Right. So from a processing point of view, there is beneficiation that happens on the mineral itself before we speak of beneficiation that takes place on the marketplace, where people buy those mineral products to make things, or to manufacture batteries, or to manufacture appliances that are used in electricity generation or transmission. The process of mineral beneficiation is starting from the mining process itself to enriching of that mineral at the mine site, and then you take it onto a smelter to try and refine it further into a pure metal or a pure mineral, to take the mineral into its purest form before it's then applied into manufacturing sector. That bit of beneficiation within the mineral value chain itself, not much of it has been taking place in the continent. It's happening from mining up to a concentrate grade level of a mineral, where it's a concentrate, but it's still encapsulated in a lot of other mineral gangs that must still be removed until it becomes a pure mineral. So that aspect of smelting, refining, bringing in that technology onto the continent, and very modern technologies that are, made in the context of climate adaptation. Not like what we have been seeing, where some countries are bringing, decommissioned plants out of their countries onto the continent. They are decommissioned elsewhere because they're causing a greater harm to the environment, but they just decommission them there and bring them onto the continent in the name of enhanced beneficiation or enhanced participation in value chain, but doing a lot of damage to the environment. So these things must be read and understood in context. Yes, we want to participate in the value chain, but it must be done in a climate smart manner for the development of a climate resilient economy in Africa. We also want to see mineral stewardship, responsible extraction of those minerals, and the management of our mineral wealth, in so much so that the economy is balanced. So you don't just have the mining, you can also have the manufacturing. So the manufacturing bit is what you're seeing now. If what's taking place between Zambia and DRC, for the first time, we've seen two countries in the SADC coming together to set up a special economic zone, which they are calling Kinseve, for the manufacture of at least the preliminary components that are required in battery manufacturing. I'll give you the number for that. The estimated budget as assessed by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, as well as the Afreximbank, the investment required for that to take place is about 30 billion. But the upside, the projection or the prognosis of revenues from that is estimated at 7 trillion United States dollars coming out of setting up a facility like that. So yes, the 30 billion may look like a very big ask now, but you look at the benefits, you look at what analysts are forecasting as the electric batteries industry value per annum from 2030 onwards. They're looking at 300 billion, a market of 300 billion US dollars annually as the collective market for battery appliances, battery, whatever, all those utensils associated with battery manufacturing. And as Africa, I think we're only participating in 1% of that number. So the scope is huge for growing that cake and for Africa to take up meaningful participation in that area.
Absolutely. Allow me to just play devil's advocate here for a minute. We know that even places like the US and Europe, they are struggling to compete with China when it comes to the sort of the higher end of the value chain, whether it's electric battery manufacturing, electric vehicle manufacturing. A skeptic might say, what chance does Africa have to muscle its way into this space in a meaningful way? How would you respond to a perspective like that?
So yes, if you're looking at it from a pure competition point of view, pure capitalistic competitive, Africa doesn't seem to have that comparative advantage to bring itself forward and play center stage in these developments, because we have predominantly remained as a supplier of raw materials from ages. I mean, I often use this example that when it was slavery time, Africa was shipping slaves, we're shipping human bodies. When that was abolished and the world went into industrialization, we started shipping raw materials, and that hasn't changed. And we're still doing that in one form or the other, either human capital or resources. So we lacked the comparative advantage that required us to set up or increase our participation in the value chain. Why? Because there was talk of capital, the capital which we didn't have. Why did we need the capital? Because the technology was resident elsewhere. So the technology was resident in Europe or in America. You need to bring that technology, you must pay for it. And you need to pay for it how? You need to use their capital, their money to pay for it, which unlike China positioned itself as a jurisdiction where all these global companies elsewhere could relocate their factories. And so there was a transfer of knowledge and information, and they quickly tapped into expertise. So from a pure capitalist or competitiveness point of view, I would say, yes, you're right. But if this discussion is looked at from a different perspective, so we're talking about the global governance issues that are required to be tackled in this conversation of climate change, building a climate resilient global economy, then one is forced to look at organizations such as your World Trade Organization, the United Nations, to then come in and prop up Africa in a manner that ensures that, so all these institutions that are responsible either for shaping or driving the transformation that is needed for the globe to transition from fossil fuels to green energy, the policies that are going in there, the governance frameworks that are being, is set up, should have some deliberate strategies in them, embedded in the anticipatory strategies that get Africa to be brought in to play a meaningful role in this whole transition, in the context that we are part of the global ecosystem.
And on that point, I mean, things are happening. It's not that nothing is going on. You already mentioned that DRC and Zambia, they are partnering. They've set up a special economic zone. My understanding is that Zimbabwe has just opened a lithium processing plant and is looking to position itself in terms of moving up the value chain there. And for me, quite interestingly, over the last few months, there have been a number of big announcements around investments into EV battery plants in Morocco, a country that isn't a critical minerals producer, but we've had at least, I think, 2 or 3 big announcements, including a multi-billion-dollar project to build Africa's first giga battery factory in Morocco. And just last week, I think there was another announcement, a South Korean company and a Chinese company. They are planning to set up a joint operation in Morocco to service the North American market to provide EV battery materials. So things are happening. And I would love to get your perspectives on what's happening in a country like Zimbabwe. And if you have any thoughts on how it is that Morocco seems to be able to position itself and what that might tell us about how other African economies can come together here. There's also next month, the first ever African Critical Minerals Summit is taking place. I believe it's being hosted in South Africa. So there is action taking place, and there is actually investment going into the value chain on the continent as well. So yes, in macro terms, Africa might not on paper, be the most competitive, but things are happening.
Yes, you are right. Things are happening, but we still front for entities that bring capital. So you mentioned the Zimbabwe example. We have Chinese firms that came and bought deposits, very big deposits and lucrative deposits, because they've got very good grades and so forth, and setting up manufacturing, so mining and then processing facilities on site, so that you comply. One complies with the regulatory standard that says you can't, ship out unbeneficiated lithium. But this is on the mineral value chain, as I alluded to earlier, to say we're just upgrading or enriching the mineral to a certain level of purity. In terms of the manufacturing capacity, the country does have manufacturing capacity for motor vehicle assembly, for instance. The country does have manufacturing capacity for battery manufacturing. We have some factories that manufacture batteries here. The ordinary use batteries that use in vehicles or so forth. We have that capacity. It would need to be expanded or redefined. We would need to maybe, we had an industry conference just a few days ago in the Victoria Falls, where it's now the government is setting up policies geared at attracting investment into these sectors that we're saying we want growth and participation. We want participation and growth in such areas. So the scope is still there. Yes, so you have a big announcement in Morocco, you have an announcement that who owns it? Where is the money coming from? And after the production, who is going to benefit? Because if it's an entity that is owned by someone foreign or listed on some foreign exchange elsewhere, all the profits will still go out. But that said, that's not to say we don't want foreign capital, you need it. So it's just to say, let's have deliberate policies. And you're right, I mean, the summit taking place in Johannesburg in November, I think that this discussion is still in its nascency. There is still scope for governments to set up anticipatory policies that ensure that there's greater participation by the continent, in the continent, for the continent, in the value chain of these critical minerals.
I suppose one way to look at it is that, yes, it's nascent, but I mean, these are in many ways kind of important first steps. I mean, you're absolutely right about the question of, well, who owns it? You know, who ultimately calls the shots in terms of the investments that are being made. But I guess the challenge there is just on what terms these investments are being made, and those terms will ultimately define whether or not the value down the road is actually transferred to host countries, be it Morocco, be it Zimbabwe, be it Zambia, or any other African country. Now, one final area I want to get your thoughts on before we wrap up is where countries like Norway and the Nordics fit into this picture. And we are the Norwegian-African Business Association, so that's the perspective we're coming from. You don't hear too much about the Nordics when it comes to critical minerals, but there is obvious opportunity, and they are as interested in the green transition as anyone else. How would you characterize, the potential for partnership between, say, Norway and African mineral producers, or the Nordic region more broadly?
Right. If you allow me, I want us, so we are having a conversation around critical minerals production. My remit is that this is a discussion about, it's a product. This is a product of something. What is the something that we're discussing? The bigger agenda, the bigger item on the agenda is the issue of achieving a net zero carbon emissions economy or globe or planet by certain targeted years in accordance with the Paris Climate Agreement. So we are all part of an ecosystem, and I keep on saying that. The climate agenda should be the driving imperative. And so for there to be cohesion, we shouldn't have these conversations in silos. There's this discussion about where is the minerals being produced, who controls what. But we want to develop this conversation in the context of a bigger context, which is climate adaptation and developing a climate resilient global economy. So once you look at us from that perspective, that we are a key component of this ecosystem that is driving towards the preservation of our ecosystems as humanities, or ecosystems of our global forests or global heritage sites or water sources, etc. It ceases, therefore, to be a conversation about who is where and who does what. It becomes a very much a collaborative discourse. And I think Norway has taken leadership, starting with your energy sources yourselves. I think they're quite green. You have taken leadership in that. When I visited you, I saw a lot of cars that are, electric vehicle cars. And much of it, I think, is subsidized in terms of allowing people to buy those cars and so forth. So you already have a level or measure of leadership, if I were to put it mildly, but I think there's a lot more that you've done in ensuring that there's leadership, there's policy and regulatory effort that is going into deliberately driving your country or your Nordic region into an environment-friendly or climate-smart region. I'm sure you've got a lot to share and transfer with your African colleagues that are seated with the natural resources that either are required in ensuring that there is continued generation of that energy, or resources that are required in the broader preservation of the global climate, so that we limit the impacts of or the progression of climate change. So I think that the Norwegians or the Nordic countries can play center stage, if not just from an economic point of view, but from a call it survival, or from a humanities point of view, that we need to drive this agenda together, even with the weaker countries, to make sure that there's meaningful participation by everybody.
It will come as
so
no
how
surprise.
would you do that? So there is, in answering your question as to the role that you could play, the mobilization of funding, for instance. So we can talk and talk all we want, but where action is required, someone is going to have to finance it. So there's need for investment, to mobilize investment. There's need for technologies that are efficient and super smart in making sure that we don't use abundantly, but we also we don't just use whatever resources are available, but
It looks like we have a connection issue. Are you still there, Isabela? Nope. Hopefully Isabela can reconnect shortly. Okay, you're back. We lost you there for a few seconds. You were just commenting on, we lost you when you were making the point that somebody has to actually put in the investment. You know, it's all good to talk, but ultimately you have to walk the walk, right?
Yes. So we need the money. The Nordic countries could help us mobilize the much needed funding. And that funding would then persuade the setting up of critical structures, be it institutional or private sector driven investments that are geared towards, you know, driving or nudging us in the right direction in terms of this transition to green energy, and also participation by African countries. Then, you know, information sharing, knowledge sharing, and that sort of, without obviously infringing on one's rights to you know, to title to your expertise, because that's what gives you your comparative advantage, if you like. Yeah, collaboration, I think, would be the key word.
And perhaps that can be our key takeaway from this conversation. We have to wrap up. Unfortunately, there's obviously a lot more to be said about this topic. And as I alluded to earlier, in many ways, we're only just getting started in terms of critical minerals and exactly how this space is going to develop, where Africa fits into the picture. But I really like your take on it, that what's needed is a collaborative approach. When we speak of the green transition, which is, of course, intrinsically linked to the issue of climate change, this is not a challenge for an individual nation or an individual or a particular region. It is really, I mean, this is a planet-wide challenge. And I can only hope that that message of collaboration is something that resonates globally. Isabela, before we wrap up, is there anything you want to add before we finish? Maybe a key message from you, or do you think that we've covered what we need to today?
I think we have covered all that we could today, but just to say there is hope. I think the continent is ready. Like you said, a lot of things are happening. I was just reading now about the Lobito corridor. We talk about mineral production, but we forget the logistics issue. Motor NGO, and I can't remember who they've partnered with to do the rail corridor from Lobito port in Angola to DRC and Zambia, so that we don't transport the minerals by road, we do it by rail. So there's a lot of exciting things happening on the continent, and I'm sure a greater collaboration should mean that we stay connected and, you know, sharing ideas and helping each other. And that's the way to go. I represent Ecobank. So I talk not just about Zimbabwe, I talk about all the other African countries because I'm the Ecobank Group mining finance specialist. So I'm working with a lot of the African countries insofar as mineral production and financing is concerned. And that's why I'm saying we need greater cooperation around fundraising. You know, there are so many interesting projects around, but where is the money? No one is willing to bring the money. I hear there's a lot of climate money, but where is the money? We want to be able to mobilize funds into those areas and give Africa greater access to energy and, you know, get people to participate in this transition.
This is a topic we will return to, and I'm pretty sure that we will invite you back, Isabela, at a future date to carry on this conversation, because as you've just alluded to, you know, there are a lot of other pieces that go into this rather big puzzle around how all of this comes together. But for now, all that's left for me to do is to thank you very much for taking the time and sharing your insights and perspectives. It's been a great discussion, and we look forward to continuing it in future. Thank you so much, Isabela.
Thank you, and goodbye to NABA for now.